Chapter 10, The Triumph of White Man's Democracy. By the 1830s, the United States was a democratic society with notable limitations. Women and African Americans continued to be denied political and legal rights, and among white males, the inequity between rich and poor grew wider. Democracy in theory and practice. Americans in the 1820s and 1830s no longer feared that democracy would lead to anarchy. Each individual was to be given an equal start in life. But equality of opportunity did not mean equality of result. The American people were happy to accept a society of winners and losers. Democracy and society. Despite persistent and growing economic inequality, Americans generally believed that they had created an egalitarian society, and in many ways they had. Political equality for all white males was a radical achievement, and Americans came to prefer the self-made man to one who was inherited wealth or refinement. The egalitarian spirit carried over into an attack on licensed professions, and it was believed that any white male should have a chance to practice law or medicine, whether or not he was trained. Democratic culture. The democratic ethos also affected the arts in this period. Artists were no longer working for aristocratic elite, but for a mass audience. Many writers and painters pleased the public by turning out Gothic horror stories, romantic women's fictions, melodramas, or genre paintings that lovingly depicted the American way of life. More serious artists sought to inspire the masses with neoclassic sculptures or landscapes that of untamed nature. Only a few individuals like Edgar Allan Poe were truly avant-garde romantic artistes. Democratic political institutions. Democratic ideals had a real impact on American political system. Nearly all adult white males gained the right to vote whether or not they had property. Offices that had been appointed, such as judgeships or electoral college, were made elective. The greatest change took place in the style of politics. Professional politicians emerged, actively seeking votes and acting as servants of the people. Economic issues. Economic questions prompted by the Panic of 1819 and the role of the federal government were major concerns that assisted a great swell of popular political interests. Fears of economic conspiracy engendered fervent outcries for republicanism's survival. The government's role in guiding the economy inspired debate. Labor, radicalism, and equal rights. Working Men's Party and trade union emerged as workers became convinced that the government should protect the rights of labor as well as those of the producers. Abolitionists sought an end to slavery and supported the civil rights of free African Americans and women. Jackson and the politics of democracy. The period from 1820s to the 1840s is with some justice called the Age of Jackson. This section explains why. The election of 1824 and John Quincy Adams's administration. The election of 1824 furthered Jackson's political career even though he lost the election. The election began as a scramble between 5 men: John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Andrew Jackson. Because no one received a majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives had to decide the election, and its choice came down to Adams or Jackson. When Clay gave his support to Adams, the House elected him president. Adams began his administration under a cloud of suspicion because it was widely believed that he had bought the presidency. By 1826, it was apparent that Adams had failed as a president. The Jackson forces had took over control of Congress simply by giving every special interest whatever it wanted. Jackson comes to power. The Jackson people, who became the Democratic Party, were well organized for the election of 1828. The Democrats appealed to the section of self-interested and pioneered the art of making politics exciting to the average man. But the greatest asset of the Democrats had was Jackson himself. Rigid and forceful, Jackson was accepted as a true man of the people, and he defeated Adams easily, especially in the slaveholding states. Jackson's triumph was a personal one. He stood on no political platform. As president, he democratized the office by firing at will whatever office holders he did not like, defending the practice by asserting the right of all men to a government post. Indian removal. Jackson inherited the Indian removal policy from previous administrations and carried it to its harshest conclusion. He agreed with the southern states that the federal government had not pushed the Indians hard enough. When the Cherokee Nation resisted removal, Jackson asked Congress to take a stern action even though the Cherokee were civilized, according to white standards. In 1830, Congress voted to depose the Cherokees, and in 1838, the U.S. Army forced the Indians to move west in a march that killed many of them. The nullification crisis. The South had reasoned to fear a strong national government that might someday decide to do something about slavery. Led by John C. Calhoun, Southern intellectuals began working out a defense of states' sovereignty. The first major controversy between federal authority and states' rights came when South Carolina objected to the high tariffs of 1828. The South, however, trusted Jackson to be sympathetic. South Carolina took no action on the 1828 tariffs. By 1832, the Carolinas had come to distrust Jackson, his party, as a result of a personal feud between Jackson and Calhoun, but mainly because South Carolina feared a forceful president and Jackson rejected the idea of state sovereignty. When in 1832 a new tariff was passed, South Carolina, still unhappy with the rates, nullified it. Jackson responded by threatening to send the army into South Carolina. Both sides eventually retreated. South Carolina got lower tariffs, but Jackson had demonstrated the will of the federal government to rule the states by force, if necessary. The Bank War and the Second Party System. One of the most important actions taken by Jackson was his destruction of the Bank of the United States. The Bank War was a symbolic defense of democratic values and led to two important results: economic disruption and the two-party system. Mr. Biddle's Bank. Although the Bank of the United States contributed to the economic growth and stability of the United States, it had never been very popular. In a democratic era, it was open to charges of giving special privileges to a few. Its manager, Nicholas Biddle, was a competent man who looked and behaved like an aristocrat. Although, in an era of rising democracy, the bank possessed great power and privilege without accountability to the public. The bank veto and the